Good evening. We are thrilled that Tony Foster is in town. It's been a few years already since he's been able to visit his namesake museum due to the pandemic. But now, just off the Green River less than a week ago, Tony joins us to tell about his recent experiences creating his 18th journey, Watercolor Diaries from the Green River, which will open middle of next year in Cody, Wyoming. And nature journalist and adventurer, John Muir and Tony, here he's coming up. They are a true dynamic duo when they get going in conversation. We are very lucky tonight that we can eavesdrop on their sharing of passions and process. I want to start the conversation off and ask Tony, what was it that sparked this whole journey?
I was always fascinated by those little Green River fossilized fish, and I used to buy them in rock shops. Whenever I saw a nice one, I would buy it in a rock shop. And they're 50 million years old, and many of them are absolutely perfectly preserved. And I used to give them to my friends on their 50th birthdays, because people on their 50, they moan, "Oh, I'm getting older, blah, blah, blah." And I'd say, "Look, you're not old. This is 50 million. Just get yourself in perspective." And so I then started thinking about doing a big exhibition, which I'm still working on, called Exploring Time. And I thought, well, it'd be jolly useful to have a piece of work from the Green River with a fossil as part of the souvenir underneath it, or the talisman underneath it, a 50 million year old fossil. And that could well serve a place in an exhibition about time. And so I went to paint a wonderful thing called Steamboat Rock, which is in the middle of the Green River. The Green River meets the Yampa River, and the two of them go round in a great horseshoe around this fantastic rock that sticks up in the middle. I went with a friend and sat and painted quite a big painting of Steamboat Rock. And it took about 5 or 6 days, I suppose. And he sat there with me a couple of times. I used to scale this cliff every day, about 300 feet up a cliff, walk across this mesa and sit right on the edge of it, looking down on the Green River as it created this beautiful horseshoe. And he said, my friend said, it'd be quite a nice river to do a rafting journey on, wouldn't it? So I said, yeah, I suppose it would. And he said, do you want me to organize one for you? So I said, oh, sure, why not? So he said, I'll organize one for next year. So next year I went, and with a whole bunch of people, and we did a 5-day rafting journey on the Green River. And after that, I then was invited to be artist in residence at the Whitney Western Art Museum in Cody, Wyoming. And so I spent a very pleasant 10 days there, I think, working on these little paintings. And at the end of it, the curator, Karen McWhirter, said, took me out for a drink and said, we got on very well and the thing had gone well. And she said, would you like to do a show for us? And I said, well, as a matter of fact, I think the Green River is quite interesting. And so, yeah, I would do a moderately sized show for you, in a couple of years' time about the Green River. So that's how it all started. And so subsequently, the Green River show has kind of disappeared off from this original intention, which was to be part of the Time show, and become a show on its own. And it just shows really what a tiny starting point you need to actually devote, 2 years of your life to a river that I hadn't even thought anything about, really. And most people, unless you happen to live in Wyoming or Utah, wouldn't even know where it was, or who cares? But actually, of course, if you dig deeply enough into any wonderful geographical object, you'll find it's pretty interesting. And so that is what I've found. It is pretty interesting.
I love that, the description of you need something sort of to start you, to get your boat in the water, and then you're going to follow that river wherever it goes.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, whatever the consequences are, and of course the problem has been that the pandemic has taken a big chunk out of everybody's lives, and it took a chunk out of mine just the same as everybody else's. And so this show has taken a darn sight longer than I ever thought it would. I thought I would be finished in 2 years, but in fact I started it probably four or 5 years ago now, and I'm still working on the second half of it, really.
So we had a conversation before you left for this, where your MO prior to COVID was that you would go out into these amazing remote wild places and work on these monumental canvases. Mm-hmm. And there's quite a bit of adventure in that. And then during COVID, you worked from home in Cornwall and did daily walks to find just a little moment of beauty each day.
Yes.
Which was, I think, a wonderful way of just sort of intentionally changing things up to go to the size that most people feel comfortable with.
Right.
But then this is the first time that you are venturing out again on a major expedition.
Yes.
And I was wondering about what that was like for you to, after a few years of not doing these, to face that again. And also I think kind of part of there's a real disadvantage to being Tony Foster, and that is that everybody expects you to come out and create a Tony Foster. Like, that's pressure.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So as you were kind of going into this, how did you kind of prepare yourself to kind of go back into the adventure and the risk of this? And what was that like?
Well, that's a very perspicacious question, really, because I faced it with great trepidation, to be perfectly honest. I'm 76. I can't pretend that my eyesight is getting any better. I can't pretend my hand is getting any steadier. And I certainly can't pretend that I can haul 48-pound packs up mountains anymore, like I used to. And so a big gap, like 3 years at my age, is quite a serious thing to overcome. And I wasn't at all convinced that I still had either the strength or the willpower or the skill to produce the kind of work I've been producing for the last 30 or 40 years. And so I faced it with some trepidation, and as a matter of fact, if I could have got out of doing it, I would have. As Jack has said, that I did spend basically 3 years, I suppose, at home in Tywardreath in Cornwall, which is a beautiful place. And what I discovered during my lockdown diaries, by the way, in the end, the first lockdown diary, which you could see in the foyer here, was 56 days of observations every day for 56 days. And I wasn't looking for anything grand. I was looking for tiny, interesting things. It could just be sticks washed up on a beach. It could be a cormorant drying its wings standing on a rock. It could be the sun coming out from behind the clouds. It could be a nice-looking tree. It could be anything that I would go out purposely every day to find something that I could just rejoice in and make a little painting of and make some comments about the day. And so that was 56 days, the first lockdown. The second lockdown was 28 days, and I did the same thing. The third lockdown was 77 days. This is in the UK. And I did the same thing. So altogether, I can't remember how many that is, but it's like 156 observations. And so I had got used to kind of working on that scale. And the idea of coming back to working on a 4-foot painting, which is what I have here, a couple of them, was quite frightening, really. And the idea that I was going to have to, crawl in and out of a tent again. I mean, I worked out the other day, or I worked out with my pals, that I've spent something like 8 years living in a North Face tadpole tent. And a North Face tadpole is about this high. And I noticed this time when I was crawling out of it, I was like an arthritic alligator, kind of crawling my way out of this tent. Not in the least the kind of elegant hero I was hoping to be. And so, yeah, I knew that it was going to be difficult, and I knew that I also knew that I wasn't at all certain I could make the paintings I wanted to make. But I must say that fortunately, I mean, certainly the physical side of it wasn't as, it was difficult. I can't pretend it wasn't. Particularly the last 10 days, which were spent on the Green River, which was as near to misery as you could get. But canoeing the Green River, I'll tell you all about it in a minute. But the actual making the painting, I found I was probably a little slower than, because I was no longer practicing working on a large scale. So I'm probably a little slower than I was, I think. But I don't think there's any loss in quality. And my wife Anne says to me, "So when are you going to retire?" And I said, "Well, I'll retire when I start to get worse. When my paintings start to get worse, I'll stop." Because I think any professional artist is extraordinarily self-critical. And I will know perfectly well when the paintings begin to deteriorate. And when that happens, I'll stop. Because nobody likes to feel that they're producing things which actually aren't up to the standard which they think they should be at. But anyway, I think the paintings I've got here, which, if you're a nice audience, I'll show you a bit later. Of course, they're unfinished, but I think I have a hunch that there isn't any loss of quality, and that they will turn out to be, as good as I hope they will. But so I suppose it's a long answer to a short question once again, but the answer was I did face it with some trepidation. In fact, I told a lot of my friends, I said, I'm really not looking forward to this. I don't know how it's going to work out, and I'm pretty concerned about it, which I was.
Yeah. You mentioned that the craft that you do requires strength, skill, and will.
Yeah.
And and that this trip itself, this adventure, was quite a physically challenging one. You've been in, spent a lot of time in sub-zero conditions,
yeah,
sketching underwater, in blistering sun, in adverse conditions, being swarmed by hordes of mosquitoes. Just sort of physically, what was your experience of kind of going into the field like this time? And I'm interested in part of me is just sort of like, the stories of there was this awful day. Mm-hmm. But I'm also wondering if it's only when you kind of expose yourself out there to those kinds of elements that you give yourself the opportunity to encounter the sublime. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about those two extremes in your experience.
Well, I mean, the work has always been about wilderness, and by its nature, to work in a wilderness, you have to. First of all, you have to take some chances, but secondly, you have to somehow get in there. It's not a wilderness if there's a road in there. It's not a wilderness if there's an airport nearby you can step out of and disappear into the forest. It's not a wilderness if there's a gas station or motel. It's only a wilderness if there's no real evidence of human beings at all. And that's what I've been working on for nearly 40 years now. And so I can't pretend that the Green River fits entirely into that category. But nonetheless, there are parts of it and places you can go to where you do have the sense that there aren't many people around and that you are actually in a fairly remote spot. And so that side of it, I guess the Green River fulfilled. The last 6 weeks have been spent in 3 places. First of all, I went to the headwaters of the Green River, which are up in the Wind River Range in Wyoming, which is a partly granite range, and not that many people go there. And so I spent the first couple of weeks working on the headwaters of the Green River, which is a place called Green River Lakes, which are very exquisite lakes. And I spent a couple of weeks there, and there we had conditions, not bad conditions. I think we were only up at about 7,000 or 8,000 feet at the highest. And I guess the temperatures went down to maybe, I don't know, 18 or 14 degrees Fahrenheit and up to 85. So it was a very fluctuating temperatures, but nothing extreme really. And then the second couple of weeks was spent in Canyonlands. I was doing a painting looking down on the Green River from a high point in Canyonlands, a place called Willow Flat, looking down on the Green River snaking its way through the desert there. And that too got pretty hot during the day. It didn't get particularly cold at night. We had a little rain, but not very much. And that was actually quite pleasant by comparison with a lot of places I've been. The bugs weren't bad. In fact, I hardly got bitten at all. And so that was I wouldn't say it was a doddle. It was hard work every day, but nonetheless, it was pretty straightforward. But the Green River itself, we did a 10-day canoeing trip on the Green River, doing about 100 miles to its confluence with the Colorado. And that was, what would they say? If you in the 1930s, you say it was beastly. It was, the river was very, very low. It was incredibly muddy. Mud was just the thing that qualified our entire day. You got out, you trod in mud, you were knee deep in mud. At one point, David, my friend who's the filmmaker making a film about me, the man who was his friend who was in the back of his canoe was actually crutch deep in mud, if you can imagine such a thing. And it was perfectly normal for us all to be knee deep in mud whenever we tried to get onto the bank in order to have lunch or in order to have a tea break, which of course is important to me, for heaven's sake, I can't operate without. And if you can imagine, and also all the banks have been taken over by tamarisk, which is an invasive plant, which means that it's very difficult for you to find a camping site. You can't see the bank. You can only see a wall of tamarisk, which is impenetrable. And so although there are designated campsites along the Green River, it's nearly impossible to find them because there's just this screen of tamarisk. And so one day, you know, we hoped we would canoe perhaps at 12 miles. We ended up doing over 20 miles because we just could not find anywhere to stop. And having found somewhere to stop, you then about 3, 4, 5, 6 feet below where you've got to get all your stuff up, and that is a mud bank. So you have to cut steps in that if it's solid enough to do that, and then haul up. I mean, normally when I'm backpacking, you know, everything is reduced in weight as much as possible. I'll do anything to save half an ounce. But with canoeing, everybody goes, oh, we can put lots of stuff in a canoe. We can have coolers, we can have ice, we can have fresh vegetables, we can have, and it just goes on, and you end up with vast stores of heavy stuff, which has to be hauled then from your canoe through the mud up to 6, 8, 10 feet, shoved up there, and then carted to a dry spot where you can actually pitch a tent. And so to say it was misery would be an understatement. Halfway through, I did kind of apologize to my companions, saying, look, had I known what it was going to be, had the Utah Tourist Board actually told us what it might be like, we wouldn't have done it. I'd have found a different way of saying something about the Green River. And then the idea, of course, the other thing is that most people doing that journey feel they've achieved an enormous amount just to do the journey. But then add on to that the fact that I also have to paint pictures at the same time, and you can see how exhausting it is for a man of my age and fragility. So I wouldn't say that it was all that much fun, but on the other hand, the wonderful, wonderful thing about it was that there were 8 of us all together, David and Robin. David and Robin were doing the filming, and David's assistant, Rachel, a young student from Cornwall who's come over to learn her trade as a filmmaker. So that's 3, there's me, 4, and then 4 women from Seattle, 2 of whom I've known for years and years, one of whom I've known since she went to school, and her sister-in-law, and 2 of their friends who I've never met before. But we were the happiest group that I've traveled with for many, many years. simply because we were all facing this common foe, really. The river, the tamarisk, the mud, and just to add to the pleasure of the whole thing, we had this tremendous thunderstorm one night, which not only, the sound was just extraordinary. It was Wagnerian. I mean, the sound of this thunderstorm rattling off the canyon walls was just extraordinary. I loved that. It was so dramatic. But on the other, what I didn't love was the fact that the rain was coming down like absolutely like bullets hitting our tents. And in fact, my tent, which had been lent to me by two friends, because instead of having to crawl out of my tadpole, I was telling them all about it, and they said, borrow our tent, it's got a side door, you can get in and out much easier. But unfortunately, what they didn't know, and I didn't certainly, was that the glue of the zip, the zip was glued to the fabric, and for some reason, they didn't think to use waterproof glue. And so the zips came off, and so the rain poured into the tent, and we were very fortunate because we happened to have camped on a rock bench that night, was just very lucky for us. But some people who tied their canoes in tight, the river rose 2 feet during the night, and so their canoes ended up upside with the nose down, and everything in the canoe washed down the river. And some people washed out of their campsites and had to abandon them in the middle of the night. But we were very fortunate, actually. We didn't have to do that. But the nice thing was, as I was saying, that I didn't hear a single complaint from anybody except me. Nobody bitched, nobody complained, nobody said, I wish I wasn't doing this. Nobody said, you fooled us, Foster. You never told us it was going to be like this. And at the end, when we had our Sherpa's supper, which is one of my traditions, that we all go to a restaurant, I treat everybody to a Sherpa's supper. It was the most emotional experience saying goodbye to everybody, because we bonded so closly because of all the difficulties. So there's always an upside to these things, even if you don't immediately recognize it.
I think that's huge. I mean, you're regularly exposing yourself to incredibly physically uncomfortable conditions. And
I know, daft, isn't it?
But what I love about it is that, well, several things. One is that in the presence of these difficult conditions where, there's your watercolor is perhaps freezing on your page, or, you're so deep in mud that you have to pull your friend out. Did you guys lose any shoes in the mud?
Yeah, we did, yes.
I thought so.
But actually we found it much easier to not use shoes in the mud.
But you then go do it again? And again, and not only that, here you're describing this particularly difficult situation, and you're saying this is particularly where the group was filled with joy.
Yeah.
And what is it that allows us to get to, I know you don't have to have all the answers, but I was wondering what are some of the factors that go into having a mindset so that in the face of adversity like this, or whatever adversity we're facing, we find beauty. Like, just another example is your COVID notebooks, right? In the face of COVID, I have a copy of your your first COVID diaries on my wall. Mm-hmm. And there is one with this pink tree where you're remembering a dear friend who's just died of the disease. In the face of these hardships, whether it's disease, freezing temperatures, scorching sun, biting insects, knee-deep mud, thunderstorms that are, you describe it as Wagnerian. I mean, you keep walking into it, and more than that, inviting it to be a part of your life with love and with joy. and that is contagious to the people around you. I know you're saying that you were grouchy, but those sort of dynamics don't happen without, also really setting a role model. What are ways any ideas you have of being open to those challenges and still finding the beauty of this world around you?
Well, that's a very profound question. I guess, I think I've got a pretty positive personality, I must admit, but...
Note the suspenders.
I'll say. Good old Andy Warhol.
Oh, yeah.
Good old Andy Warhol. And I guess, I suppose, I don't want to go into this too much, but I left school very early and rather under a cloud when I was 16, and so never really had an education. But on the other hand, I did, launch out very fast into the world, and what I discovered was that generally speaking, things don't work out as badly as you think they're going to, and so that gave me, that gave me a positive aspect, I suppose, on life. And I always thought that, things probably would work out okay. And generally speaking, well, in fact, more than generally speaking, I'd say 95% of the time they have. I've had a very fortunate life. In many, many ways, I've always pursued my own ideas about what I want to do. And generally, I'd say most of the time, it's worked out that somehow or other this has come through. And a lot of my work really has been, I suppose, challenging the idea that, it's impossible to do a 6-foot painting at 18,000 feet on Everest. And I think, well, I don't suppose it's impossible. It's probably pretty difficult, but I bet it's not impossible. And whether it's possible to actually go and paint all 3 faces of Everest when most, the vast number of people who've been to Everest have never, ever seen the east face because it's so difficult to get to. And I thought, well, some people get there, so it must be possible.
So why not bring a 6-foot canvas?
Yeah. And similarly with many of the things I've done, I suppose they've been sort of testing the boundaries of an idea of what, how you can make a watercolor. And I suppose the other thing I suppose in my personality is that I am absolutely bloody minded. If I decide I want to do something, then I will keep going at it until something cracks. And usually, so far, I've managed to push my way through whatever the difficulties are. And I suppose I'm lucky with my friends, I'm lucky with my traveling companions, I'm lucky with the people who support what I do. I've just been incredibly fortunate throughout my life. And so I guess there's no reason why I shouldn't feel positive. And if that rubs off on other people when I'm traveling with them, then that's great. I do say, by the way, when people volunteer to come with me, I do, if they've never been with me before, I do say, you think it's going to be interesting to see someone doing a watercolor out in the backcountry. I said, but you've heard the phrase, like watching paint dry. That's exactly what it's like watching me paint. It is really, really boring. I sit there, dab, dab, blooming dab, 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 8 hours a day, and at the end of the 8 hours, it's hard for the average person to see I've made any progress whatsoever. And so it's not an exciting practice. I'm not Jasper Johns. I'm not throwing paint at the canvas and doing exciting stuff like that. I'm working diligently, quietly, and just getting on with it. So it's not that I think that people find exciting, but I think what people do find exciting is their participation in a creative adventure. And I suppose I can, the definition to me of an adventure is an event where you don't actually know what's going to happen next. And that, I think, is true of most of the things I do. You don't actually know what's going to happen next. You have a rough idea of what you'd like to do, but there's no guarantee you're going to be able to do it. There's no guarantee you're going to be able to hike where you want to hike, or paint where you want to paint, or sleep where you want to sleep. And so the unexpected happens, and you have to cope with it. And I think we mostly live pretty ordered lives, I think, and we know, we know when our next paycheck is coming, or you do, I don't, but we plan our lives as if whatever we plan is going to happen. But there's a wonderful phrase, which is, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. Because, of course, the unexpected happens all the time to somebody. And to learn to cope with that. And I think people like the idea of just pushing the boundaries and seeing what they can cope with too. And I do say to people when they're going to join an expedition, I say, look, there will be times when you wish you were absolutely anywhere else than where you're going to be. But also there will be times of great joy. And the trick is to recognize you have to go through one to get to the other. I mean, an example of that, when I was working in the rainforest in Borneo, and I was staying in a research station right in the forest, and I used to get up very early. I would have my breakfast, make my lunch, pack my flask, and walk out into the forest about 3 miles down a track. And I was the first person to go down the track every morning, and because I get up early to go. And there was one area where there was enormous amounts of cobwebs. And I would walk through these cobwebs because nobody else had been down there. I would break all the cobwebs, so I'd be covered. Have you seen Lord of the Rings where Frodo gets caught bound up by anyway, it was like that. I felt like that. Covered in cobwebs, sticky cobwebs, horrible. And then after that, there was an area where I'd be caught by swarms of fiercely biting insects, which would bite lumps out of me. But they were so quick, you couldn't even swat them. They were too quick. But you'd get a lump out before you'd even noticed. And really painful bites. I'd go through that. I would be covered in mud. I would be soaking wet. If I wasn't soaking wet from the rain and the water dropping off the trees, I'd be soaking wet from the sweat because it's so humid. I would get to my painting site, about 3 miles, get to my painting site, which was near a little river. I'd take all my clothes off, I'd go and stand in the river, and the little fish would come up and nibble at my scabs, which was quite a nice feeling, actually. You feel they're kind of cleaning your scabs out. And I stood there, and I experienced a moment of absolute pure joy. And the root of that to me was that I felt that I was in exactly the right place at the right time, doing what I was supposed to be doing. And I think to be able to recognize those moments is one of the great things that we should all try to practice.
This is powerful thoughts about how we can spend this little moment of consciousness that we have on this planet. Another thing that I was thinking about is that when you expose yourself to these things, it can't help but change you.
No, that's true. Yeah.
And I was wondering about, in the course of this trip, first just in terms of, it's the first time you've been painting on the large scale again. How did you find that your way of painting has changed? Your way of interacting with that piece of paper has changed? And secondly, on not just thinking about the technique which we apply, how were you changed by this experience of following the Green River from headwaters to mud?
Well, in terms of the actual technical way of making my work, I'm afraid I would say I'm kind of in a period of stasis, and always have been, really. It's a funny thing that I've always felt I was something of an outsider, really, because my work, isn't necessarily fashionable. It's highly personal, it's figurative, it's narrative, it's often beautiful, which is a strike against it, and so I've always felt I was a bit of an outsider in the art world. And I've never really changed my style very much. I think my painting's got better over the years, and so it should. I've been practicing for 40 years, so I should have learned something. But I've always kind of thought my style, was always going to be on the outside of. It's politically committed too, which is also a bit unfashionable, or used to be. But interestingly enough, I've always thought, there's a phrase: a fast clock is never right, a slow clock is never right, but a stop clock is right twice a day. And I think I'm that stop clock. And it strikes me that I might actually be here at the right time now, because everybody's interested in the environment. Everybody's suddenly going on about it. I've been going on about it ever since I started. That's what the work's always been about. Everybody likes the sense, particularly since COVID, I think people began to value very much the whole thing of being outdoors, being fresh, getting fresh air, going for walks, slowing down the pace of your life, finding there were more profound things to be doing than simply making as much money as you possibly could. And in a way, I've been banging on about that for 30 or 40 years now. And suddenly, it seems to me that the time has swung round to accord with what I've been saying, to an extent anyway. And I do find now that there's a much more openness to the work I've been doing, and I guess that because I've been doing it for so long, I suppose people feel that I deserve some sort of respect. And so the idea of the stop clock seems to be quite one that encourages me, shall we say. But I don't think my style as a painter has changed very much at all, really. And if I do go as far as to unroll these paintings, you'll see that it's the same old dab, the same old attention to detail, the same old. It's just simply more Foster, and there's not much I can do about that. I did once think that I'd love to paint like Winslow Homer. Their lovely gestural, being able to sum up a landscape in a few deft strokes. I always admired him enormously and thought, that's how I would love to paint. I'd like to paint like that. And I thought, I'm going to cure myself of this kind of surgical precision to things that I can see. I'm not interested in accuracy, by the way. Accuracy, I don't give a damn about accuracy. If you're making a painting, accuracy is not an interesting thing to be doing. But on the other hand, truth is interesting, or at least I think it is. And so you should be truthful about what you see rather than try to be accurate. And so that means, the great landscape painter Constable said that a landscape painting is a view seen through a perception. And that's a wonderful way to look at it, because if you stood 6 landscape painters on the same spot and told them to do a landscape, they'd all be completely different. If you stood 6 people with Nikons on the same spot, they'd all take the same photograph. And so, the perception part of it is important. Anyway, I thought I'd try to cure myself of this highly detailed way of working. I would take a 6-foot sheet of paper to the Grand Canyon and force myself to paint in a more gestural, open, easy kind of way. Well, I sat there for 10 days with this 6-foot sheet of paper, and I stood back and I thought, oh my God, it's just more Foster. And there was no way I could alter the way I work. And it's like your handwriting, you just cannot alter it. If it comes naturally to you, that's the way it's going to be. And no matter how hard you try, as soon as you relax, it goes back to what it was before. And I spoke to my dealer at the time, and I went back to see her, and I said, oh, for God's sake, I said, I've tried to, loosen up, I can't do it. All I can do is what I do. And she said, Tony, most of the artists I deal with wish they painted like somebody else. But for heaven's sake, just relax and paint like yourself. Don't worry about it anymore. And so I don't worry about it. If it's going to take 10 days to do a painting, it takes 10 days. I can't help it, that's that.
What was the longest that you spent sort of going deeply into one place on this expedition?
On this expedition, it would be one of these 2 paintings, which I think would be 7 days, probably, to have got as far as I have with it, which of course is not finished by any means. There's a huge amount of work to do in the studio. But they aren't finished, but they are resolved. In other words, I'm pretty sure I know how they're going to get finished. They've made up their own rules about how they're going to finish. And so it's a matter now of me strengthening them, finishing the foregrounds generally, and working from what I've already got. In other words, the light has already been decided. I know exactly where the light's coming from now. The painting has been set at a certain time of day. As you come towards yourself, in other words, you're going from distance to foreground. As you come towards yourself, you know exactly how you're going to strengthen it and strengthen it and strengthen it until the foreground looks as if it's closer to you and the background looks as if it's further away. And so all those rules are already made with these paintings I have here. But if you look at them and think, well, crikey, they don't look like much for 7 days' work. But actually, it's enough for me to finish, and that's all I care about.
And you have been being a good audience, so I think we will get to see these.
I decide that.
So when we were eating sushi in the back room, you touched on an idea that I thought was really interesting and powerful. It was about the idea of a painting that you're working on being precious.
Oh, yeah.
And I was wondering if you could unpack that a little bit, because there were some really interesting layers to the observations that you were making around that concept of the piece of artwork and this precious thing that you can't mess up.
Yes. Well, it's not an easy philosophy to pursue, but nonetheless, I found it necessary because of the way I work. The work takes a lot of risks. It can be blown over a cliff. It can be chewed by squirrels. It can be shat on by birds. It can be ripped in a wind. It can be caught in the mud. It can get wet. All sorts of things happen to it, and they do happen. And so you have to learn to be philosophical. No matter how long this painting has taken you, no matter how long you've sat there, it can still be blown over a cliff. And it cannot become a precious object at that stage. It can't become a precious object until it's in its frame. Because if it was, you would never dare finish it. You wouldn't have the freedom to experiment with it. You wouldn't, and you certainly, it's no good bursting into tears if it flies over a cliff if you've been working on it for 5 days, which has happened to me. And certainly they always get chewed by animals and that kind of thing. But that actually, I justify that by saying, well, that's just part of the story of the work. A painter called Richard Hamilton said, a painting should demonstrate the means of its making. And the means of its making, in my case, is that it might have sat in the mud. It might have been ripped by a wind. It might have got caught. Anything might have happened to it. And so if that happens to it, then it bears the scars of its creation. And so it's no good getting upset because something's gone slightly wrong because something's happened to it. You can either just ignore that and carry on if you've still got it, or you can burst into tears and give up. And so when it's back in the studio, you can't be precious about it either. You have to be prepared. I mean, you have to be prepared. Somebody said you have to be prepared to murder your children. In other words, you have to be prepared to do something to the painting which absolutely ruins it. And with watercolors, that's a very easy thing to do. You suddenly, what you thought was water has suddenly turned to mud in the sense of the color of it. It was sparkling water one minute, it's turned to mud the next because you did something wrong. But if you didn't do that, then you wouldn't dare do anything. You've got to just keep going until the thing either succeeds or fails. I do have failures, of course I do. And I try to learn something from them. I keep my failures because they teach me a lot. And in many ways, they teach you as much as your successes. Successes often come off easier than failures. Failures are often hard to do. Successes are a lot simpler in many ways because the paint just goes where you want it to go, and it wants to go. It goes how you want it to go. And so I know that it's very tempting to you've made a beautiful gesture on the paper. It looks absolutely glorious. And you think, oh, I can't do any more to it because I mustn't spoil it. Well, you've got to finish it. Don't just leave that gesture and thinking that that is a satisfactory response, because that's not what you started off to do. You started off to make a painting, not just a few gestures which look pretty. And so, be prepared for things to be destroyed. Be prepared for them to evaporate in front of your eyes, because otherwise, the finished object will never have much virtue. And so I try to always, I'm sometimes even kind of almost purposefully brutal to the thing, because I want to cure. Everybody has this impulse to protect, but I want to cure myself of that, and so I don't consider them at all precious until they're framed, and then they are precious because you've spent a lot of money on the frame.
And that's why you came tonight, right? I mean, what a powerful notion. What a powerful concept. You don't allow yourself to make a fetish out of this experience that you're doing. You're going to go into this, you're going to play with it. This idea of welcoming these mistakes and being willing to, if we're not in that zone where we're making mistakes, then we're nowhere near the place where we can be learning. Right. And growing. Yeah. When my daughter gets math puzzles, and she's working on the puzzles, if we can do them all, then we're not challenged by the experience. And it's like, well, you got 100% on that. Wow, that's great, but I'm sorry you weren't able to learn anything there, right? And so you're letting yourself be that vulnerable in the middle of that, right? That takes real, incredible sort of presence and both, I think, bravery and humility at the same time.
Yeah, well, thank you. But I guess I am, like I suppose most professional artists, I'm extraordinarily self-critical, and I can always see people who can do things better than me. And so, it pays to be humble, I think, because you only have to compare yourself to the masters to realize how much you fall short.
And those same masters would look at your stuff and go like, whoa, check out what Tony's doing over there, right? Early on tonight, you were mentioning that at some point when you see that the artworks are, if they're starting to get worse, that would be when you would stop.
Yeah.
And that thought I found crushing. I found that crushing. Oh. Because I don't want you to stop. Oh. Well, I don't want you to stop.
I don't want to, but
even if the painting is not as pretty as one that you could have done a year or 3 years earlier. That part of this process is bringing you into the presence of that feeling that you had when you stepped into the river, with the fish nibbling your scars, right? And the minute we stop engaging with this world, so then the opportunity for those moments disappears. And I think that part of the burden you have of your professional success, I mean, they did name the museum after you, right?
Yeah, yes, they did.
And that's incredibly, that is pressure. That's real pressure. And the idea of, there's one thing that is the thing that ends up on the wall once you put the expensive frame on it, right? But there is such beauty and honesty and courage and hubris and foolishness and love that goes into this process. It makes me feel really happy to know that Tony's out on an expedition somewhere. And so I guess what I'm saying is that possible, if you stop creating things for public view, that you, in your own personal process, would still push yourself in these sort of ways, even if there wasn't going to be a display for a museum on the other side of it.
Right, yes. That's a good point. I was talking to my wife about when I was going to retire, and I said, what do you think I would do if I was retiring? I should explain, my studio has 3 windows which look out over, looks across to our local pub. And on a sunny day, I look out of the window and all my mates are sitting outside the pub having a pint in the sunshine. And I think, what the hell am I doing in here? Dab, dab, bloody dab all day. Who gives a shit? Why am I doing this? I'm sitting up here, nobody cares. And I said, I think I ought to blooming retire. And Anne said, I know exactly what you'd do if you retired. So I said, what? And she said, you'd sit around here for about 3 days, and then you'd go for a walk, and then you'd go for another walk. You'd say, oh, I saw something really interesting, and you'd go for a walk and take your paint box. She said, and you'd sit out there all day, you'd take a flask of tea, you'd come back, and then you'd have a pint in the pub afterwards. She said, but you would still keep doing exactly the same things you're doing now. So you might just as well carry on doing it. There's no point in pretending you're going to retire, because you never will. So I guess she has an insight, perhaps that accords with your wishes, that maybe. but yeah, I do know though that my next major show after the Green River show, my next big show called Exploring Time, I'm pretty sure that's going to be my last major show, because each of these big shows take 3 or 4 or 5 years to do, and I'm 76. Am I still going to be doing this when I'm 81? I rather doubt that. I don't think I'm going to be going to Galapagos and all the places I want to go to do the time exhibition when I'm 81. I think that will be my swan song as far as these major thematic exhibitions are concerned. But I already came up with a nice idea for when I've stopped doing those great shows. And one of them, I was talking to somebody about it today, in fact, and I said, what I'd really love to do is I'd love to go to Japan and find a master and sit together and do the painting of the same thing, as Mount Fuji or whatever it is, and then we just put the 2 paintings together and show them somewhere. And I thought, just do these short-term things. Don't think you've got to do another, huge 5-year project. So I guess I probably will carry on. Whether the work gets worse or not, who knows? Perhaps that'll be for other people to judge, not me. Yeah. Can I tell them about this painting that I found, which fits into the Green River show? Can I tell them about that?
Oh, yes.
Yes. It was funny because during lockdown, of course, when I'd done my lockdown diaries and so on, but we still couldn't travel, I went through my plan chest and I found several paintings actually which I'd never ever finished, quite a few actually, which I'd never ever finished, either because the show had already gone and I hadn't quite finished these few paintings, and I'd started, I'd got some from the Himalaya, for example. I found 4 that I hadn't finished, and I finished those. They're very nice. I found one from the rainforest, which was an absolute corker. The drawing on it was absolutely beautiful, and I hadn't finished it. And I loved that painting, actually, because as I was sitting painting it, 2 giant tapirs came into the clearing where I was sitting, and they were only a matter of as far away from me as that box there. And you could see that they had very bad eyesight, I think, because I was sitting quietly, they could smell me. You could see their trunks were kind of waving towards me, and they knew I was there somewhere, and then they just carried on plucking leaves off the trees and eating them. And these two giant tapirs, I mean, it's one of those experiences you only have if you sit quietly somewhere for a long time. But anyway, that was that painting. I finished that one. But then I found this painting from 1991, and it was a painting of a rock cleft like this, a vertical painting, rock cleft, 20 by 30, with this rather strange, shapely thing in the background and a pond here. And I thought, where was that? Where was I doing that? And I remembered that it was. I thought, well, I was with Bill Brace, my friend Bill Brace, who was the director of the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at MIT, who I traveled with an awful lot. And I thought, I think that was something to do with Green River. And anyway, 1991, so I looked up my diary for 1991, and sure enough, we'd done what we thought was going to be a 3-day hike across Canyonlands and down to the Green River and back. It was going to be a circular hike. And it said we walked, got caught in a sandstorm, sheltered in a cave, hid behind a cat's claw bush, and then finally made our way to the Green River, made a camp, and I did a little painting of the Green River. And then we came on our circular route to this extraordinary area of beautiful, shapely red rock, and went through this cleft, this giant cleft in the rock, and there was a pond there with trees around it. And I said to Bill, hey, we can stay a couple more days because we found some water, because we only had 3 days water with us that we took with us. And so he said, sure. So we put our tents up, and I sat there and painted this picture. But I couldn't think how to resolve the right-hand side. I just couldn't think how to do it, because the right-hand side was in shadow and the left-hand side was in light. And so I just left it, didn't do anything with it. And then I saw an exhibition by a very fine painter called Michael Andrews, who's died now, but a really, really good painter. And he had painted Ayers Rock in Australia, and I could see the way he'd cast a shadow across it. I thought, that's the way to do it. So I went home, and during lockdown, I finished this painting. And I looked up in my sketchbook for 1991, and where was this little painting of the Green River, also unfinished. And so I managed to do 2 paintings about the Green River without even having been there for 30 years. So that was I thought a great gain that I'd made, being able to kind of flesh out the exhibition a bit, at least, and write to the curator and say, I've found 2 paintings from 1991 which are from the Green River, so I've done them. And just goes to show, you shouldn't waste stuff, really. It's always good to keep all those things, and they might come in useful.
And that just makes me think, behind each one of these paintings here, there's time that you've spent on the land with a group of friends, and some of them are here with us, some have moved on. And so in each one of these paintings, there are memories of those peoples, those places, kind of the quirks of the moment. Wondering if in any of the paintings from this recent set, as you look at them, are there embedded in those? Can you think of a place where if somebody was there with you, they would be like, look, that's where we got stuck. Are there any kind of inside jokes, or like you really had to be there to sort of understand the full breadth of this story that are in this recent set of paintings?
Well, I can't pull out any particular humorous anecdotes, I don't think. But I would say that when you travel in the backcountry for periods of time with your friends, you create the most profound friendships, which I don't think you can make in any other way, unless perhaps you're in the forces and you're sent into a dangerous mission, and you talk about band of brothers and that kind of thing. I've never been in the forces, but I can imagine that that's how it might be. You get very, very close to people, and because you're depending on them for your life, they're depending on you for their lives, And that forms a bond between you, which I don't think you can find in any other way, except perhaps in a good marriage, maybe. And so that's really, I suppose, the great joy of what I've been doing for all these years, is the profound friendships I've made with people who've traveled with me, and we have never, ever forgotten it. We've never, ever forgotten those journeys. I mean, I know that some journeys are more, alter you more than others. I mean, anybody who's ever been to Nepal and Tibet would say that that was one of the profoundest things they'd ever done, because of the Buddhist philosophy, and because it's so different from the way we experience life in the West here, because the people are so generous, even though they have very little, which is also not a thing that happens in the West very much. And so that kind of journey alters everybody. But if you do that journey with the same aim, which is to produce, like I say, to have a creative adventure and actually produce something of worth at the end of it, then that is a profound way to make friends, and that is the great joy, really, of what I do. You have been a nice audience.
You want to see what's in there too?
You have been a nice audience. I will do it. Now, where's Carolyn? She was going to help me.
Oh.
I need 2 volunteers now.
I'm going to move these back a little bit. What should I hold?
Nothing. You're redundant. I've got to say before I unroll this, but if you're expecting a fully finished painting, you're going to be deeply disappointed. All we've got here is the start. It's a bit like, actually, if I think about it, it's a bit like me, showing you a skeleton and saying, imagine this is a really beautiful person. This is only the skeleton of a really beautiful painting. At least we hope it will be.
Could I just sort of on that note, though, when you look at a painting that is not finished, you also can see a lot more of the thinking process that is behind it. When something is totally worked out and finished, a lot of the process that went into it becomes obscure to us. So this is also a real opportunity to kind of look into the mind of Tony Foster and to see what he's seen.
I ever say, don't look into the mind of Tony Foster. It's an unbearable thought. This is, now let me see. Carolyn, if you would hold this end, and just hold top and bottom if you can. Okay, thank you. And what's your name?
Arush, A-R-U-S-H.
Say it again.
Arush.
Arish, is that right? Thank you, Arish. If you would hold this end. Okay, now this, as you can see, this is, can you hold it higher? Oh, okay, are you able to do that? That's better, thank you. Good. Can everybody see that all right? This is a mountain called Square Top here. And of course you can't see it because I haven't painted it yet, but this is the Green River Lake here with the reflections. You're going to have the reflections of the mountains, the reflections of the trees, and this I think was 5 days work. Now the drawing is the important part, I think, that if you get a good drawing, you can probably do the rest of it from memory. And in this case, the drawing, I believe, took me about a day or a day and a half. And then I started painting. This is a kind of, I'm pretty sure this is a volcanic plug, because this here is not at all, it's not granite at all. This is sedimentary, and then this thing is a granite plug that's stuck up. So I think it must be a volcanic plug. And the lake starts here, and it comes round here, and then becomes the Green River just at this point, really, I suppose. But of course, you can't do the water, as you'll all know, I'm sure. You can't do the water until you've done absolutely everything else, because of course the water reflects whatever's around it, and whatever colors are around it, whatever color the sky is, and so none of that can be finished until I get back in the studio, strengthen it, and then I'll do the water, the last thing, which of course is really nerve-wracking, because the water is the most difficult thing to do. And it's very easy to make a terrible mistake with that. And sometimes the water is looking vertical. you think, oh God. I remember I was painting in the rainforest, painting a river called the Rio Serena, and I went back to the bunkhouse and I said to the scientist there, I said, it's all right for you guys, water stays flat in your thing, but I've got a river that's standing vertical and I cannot get it to lie flat. And I went back the next day and I just fiddled about with it. I couldn't think what to do to make it lie flat, just fiddling about, and suddenly, bonk, it went flat. I don't know how or why, but that's just the way it is. So thank you very much. And then in the foreground here, you probably can't see it, but there are all sorts of plants and weeds and rocks and sort of grassy knoll, really. So that's in the foreground. So you're looking through that to the river, past the river to Square Top. Thank you very much, you two.
Are there
Okay.
any interesting notes written on this one?
Yeah, all sorts of notes on it, I'm sure. I can't remember what they say, but I haven't got my specs. It probably says, sort out this mess, stupid, or something like that. I'll get my specs. Are you okay, you two? Okay, your arms aren't aching? Are you all right, Carolyn? A lot of these are colour notes here. I don't know, nothing very exciting, actually. No, nothing very exciting, just colour notes, really, and about exact reflections and so on. I can see it better with my glasses on, I must admit, it looks better. Okay, thank you. We'll show the other one now. And this one is from Canyonlands, looking down on the Green River. Now, how do we unroll this one? Let's see. Which end is which? That's your end, and that's your end. Okay? That's it. Same thing, if you can hold it up nice and high, nice and flat. This is the Green River snaking its way around here and disappearing off here. This is Canyonlands. This is a thing called the Turk's Head. Powell, when he was going down the river, because Powell started his canyon journey on the Green River, because the Green River actually was a much wider and faster river than the Colorado until the two met. But the Colorado had already been named, and so the Green River simply became the Colorado. But so this is the Green here. You can see that this is a mesa, a flat mesa here, with an incredibly complex series of little canyons and things snaking their way through here. The drawing is, I'm really pleased with the drawing on this one. It's really a nice drawing. And I'm sitting looking down on this lot. So here is the foreground with huge rocks, which we hope aren't going to give way as I sit right on the edge of them. And so you'll get an incredible contrast between, there's a rock stack here, right in the foreground. Then there are big boulders here, and then here is a juniper tree, a lovely juniper tree here. So those two things contain this landscape, because otherwise the landscape goes on and on and on and on and on forever, and you have to have a way of containing it, obviously, otherwise you can't focus on anything. And so the landscape is contained by this rock stack here and this juniper tree here, both perfectly true, they were both there. And then there's a little thing here, little eye catcher called Cleopatra's Seat. I can't see Cleopatra sitting on it, but anyway, that's her seat. And so it's a matter now of strengthening this as it comes towards us, and then having a really strong foreground, so that you feel the sense that you're kind of about to fall over the edge of this vertiginous drop. Can you not see over there? I'm sorry.
Yes. Maybe we'll tilt it this way.
Can you tilt it this way? That's it. Okay, that's better. Okay. Has everybody had a chance to see it now? As best you can.
What are your brush strokes at the bottom?
Oh, that's just me testing paint. Because I'm trying, you know, I'm sitting there, I've got a Tupperware lid in one hand and a little paint box on my thumb. I'll show you my paint box. I'm sure you've seen it anyway, but this is my paint box. It's it's the only paint box I ever use. All the paintings in this entire museum have been done with this paint box. I don't use a bigger one when I get back to the studio. I just use this one. It's the Winsor & Newton Bijou #2, and certainly is Bijou. It's been adapted by me in that I put in extra colours and colours that I didn't use, I prized out and put something else in. And so I've got that on my thumb. I've got my Tupperware lid here, and I've got my paintbrush in this hand, and I've got a stack of paintbrushes and pencils. I've probably got a paintbrush in my teeth. And so I haven't got any space to have a piece of flapping paper which I'm testing colours on. So I simply test my colours on the bottom of the paper. And sometimes that stays in the painting and sometimes it gets cut off. It just depends whether if it's interfering with the look of the painting, then I cut it off. But if it doesn't interfere with it, then it's part of its story. What do those notes say? Anything exciting? No, I don't think so, does it? Oh yeah, there was something about a bird or something. I can't remember. What does it say? Two canyon swallows chasing away a white-tailed hawk. There. That's nice, isn't it? Yes. So I also make notes as I see things. Okay, thank you, my two assistants. We'll roll that up. Thank you. Thank you very much, David. You okay? Okay, let go. That's it. There we go.
Thank you both so much for helping
Yes, thank you. That's
display
super.
Tony's paintings for us. Really appreciate that. If you would like to, you can now go back to your seat, and we're going to take a couple of questions from the audience. Thank you so much for doing that, honey. Thank you. So we would love to entertain some audience from the questions, and we're going to start right here, and I'll repeat the question so make sure that everybody in the back can hear. The question was, she's seen many people sort of do watercolors in layers where they're kind of, the whole thing is kind of getting more intense as you're building in more layers. Here she is noticing that Tony Foster is starting with a section in the background and then working forward, and she's wondering if that is the usual approach and sort of what is the thinking behind that way of kind of going into the painting.
You're right, and I find that in order to retain some sort of sparkle in the painting, I don't like to do all over washes and then layer on top of layer on top of layer, because you never can get back to that sparkle. And so I tend to paint simply from background to foreground, depending. If I'm working in the rainforest, I paint from foreground to background, because right in front of you are these giant leaves, and then you can see little things through them. But generally speaking, it's background to foreground, and coming down the paper as you work, obviously. And I try to be pretty direct, really, in that you know, I try and make the painting work as it goes, and so that, you know, I don't have to do an enormous amount of revision when I get it back to the studio. And I think that some people look at my things and say, I can't even believe that is watercolor, because people are so used to this idea of watercolor being a fairly fugitive, you know, like you say, wash upon wash, thin washes, happy accidents, you know, nice things happening. But generally speaking, with mine, I'm kind of quite particular about simply working down and strengthening as I go, so I don't have to keep doing a wash over another wash and so on. That doesn't mean that I do everything. In some cases, there will be paintings where I've done, you know, 4, 5, 6 colors one over another in order to get the intensity I want. But generally speaking, I try and retain the fresh look of it, because they're done in the open air. And I notice when people come into my shows, sometimes you see them kind of taking a breath as if they've just come into fresh air. And that's because if you look, you'll find little areas where I haven't painted anything, where it's just white, the paper showing through. Not just in the mountain paintings, of course, where the snow is just the paper showing through, but also in lots of other bits and pieces, you'll find there are little just areas where I don't paint over it because I don't want the thing to go dull. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we're going to take another question from this side of the room. So I'll just repeat the question so that people in the back can hear. The gentleman was observing that many of the things that Tony seems to be doing relate to the concept of relationship. Your relationship to risk, your relationship to the other people around you, your relationship to the place, deepening as you spend time in it. And he's wondering if Tony can expand on that idea of relationship and the role of that in your process, your thinking, and your life.
Well, I guess, I mean, it's a tough question, but I guess part of it is to do with spending time. One of the things, one of the tricks, or not a trick, but one of the things I insist on when I'm traveling with my friends, Americans in particular, want to get from one place to another as quickly as possible. Even if they're hiking, swimming, going on a pogo stick, for all I know, they want to get there quick. And so we're pounding our way up a mountain. We're carrying 48-pound packs. Everybody's beginning to get a bit weary, but no, we can carry on. We've got another 8 hours of daylight. We can do 20 miles. And I say no. Every 2 hours we will stop, and we will get the stove out. We'll make tea, and we will look around us and see where we are. Because otherwise we're not experiencing anything. All we're doing is looking at our feet to make sure we're not tripping over the rocks and breaking an ankle. Because, of course, that does happen if you don't look at your feet. If you're looking at the landscape as you're walking along a track up a mountain, you could easily break your leg. So you have to pay attention to your feet. Well, it's not very exciting, is it? 8 hours looking at your feet. And so we stop, we make tea, we have a chat, we look at the landscape, we relax. And that takes half an hour, and then we get up and we carry on. And it's about opening yourself to what's around, and it's about taking time, and you build relationships by taking time. You learn how to cope with things by thinking them through. I mean, I have been in danger. I won't pretend I haven't been in dangerous situations. I can't pretend to my wife that it's not as, it's no more dangerous than sitting on the sofa watching TV, because it is a little more dangerous than that. I think if you relax into the place, I mean, David, the filmmaker who was on the river journey with me, he said we had to learn to welcome the mud. Not hate, we couldn't, no point in resenting it. You couldn't clean yourself from it. The river was filthy anyway, or full of silt. You couldn't really wash yourself properly. You just had to accept that mud was mud was the thing you were in for the next 10 days. And he was right. You had to just relax about it, and not worry the fact that you looked dirty, your feet were caked with mud, your trouser bottoms were caked with mud, your shoes were twice the size they should be because they were full of mud. You just had to just accept it, and it's about acceptance of things you can't change, I suppose, and it's about rejoicing in things that are going to uplift your spirit, and I guess it's about, like I say, spending time. You build relationships with your friends by spending time with them. You begin to understand the landscape by spending time in it. And so, yeah, I suppose don't rush. That's basically it, I think.
Just as you're talking, I'm just sort of jotting down bits of your ideas. Every couple of hours, what if in our lives we stop and made tea and saw where we were? How would our lives change? And he's chatting. He said, and we have a chat. You're talking. That's exactly what you're talking about with these relationships, opening yourself to what is around you. Relationship with the place. You're welcoming the mud. It's there having a chat with you as well, and you're not going to fight that.
There's no point in arguing with it, certainly.
We have time for one more question, and then I also have one last question for you.
Okay.
And we'll take this from this side of the room. Sir. The gentleman was noticing that Tony's skies feel really alive and dynamic. And what is the approach for that? Is that wet and wet technique? How are you handling those skies? And sort of from a technical standpoint, we want to know your secrets.
Okay. Fine. I have no secrets. Yeah, the skies are, generally speaking, wet in wet. And a big sky is a very, very tricky thing to do. I hate it when... I don't hate it, but if I'm doing a painting and I've got an all blue sky, which we had this time 2 or 3 times, that is nearly impossible to get what you call a flat wash in the field. And I could do a small one, but I couldn't do one on the scale of a 4-foot painting. And so so that means I don't start the sky until I see one that I like, and so I paint the rest of the landscape without the sky, which is an awful thing to do because, of course, all colours have to relate to each other, and you can then, if you're not careful, you've painted half the landscape, and then you paint the sky, and you discover the landscape is actually the wrong tone. It needs adjusting, and that's tedious. But nonetheless, I won't do a sky until I see one. And generally speaking, I've always been fortunate that if I wait long enough, I get the sky I need. I then lay the painting flat, which is also tedious in a way because, you know, I've had the drawing board propped up on my hiking poles and lashed down to the rocks. Quite a complicated spider's web of lashing that I do so it won't blow away. And then to undo all that and lay the thing flat is really a bore. And I try and get it into the shade if I possibly can so that the sun doesn't dry everything out far too fast. Then I apply water to all the bit where I want sky, and I then look at what sky we've got and drop colour into it, move it around, and hope that it doesn't dry out too fast. I sometimes do a very rough, arbitrary sketch of the sky I've got in pencil to give me some sort of guidance when I'm working. I often work turn around and work from the top down. In other words, do the sky upside down because otherwise I can't stretch across a 4-foot canvas in order to do the sky. So I turn around and do it from the top. And it's mostly wet in wet. If I can divide the sky up a bit, that's useful. In other words, if you've got a cloud that kind of is part of the way across the sky, that means you can have blue here and blue here. That means you can do those two wet in wets separately. In other words, you don't have to do the whole thing in one go. But it's nerve-wracking, and it's always a very nerve-wracking thing. When I was working on the canyon piece, we were very lucky. We were camping at Willow Flat, where they have a little palapa to give you some shade, and a table, which was exotic in my experience. And the table had a little seat along it, and so I put my stove on one end of my piece of paper and a rock on the other end on the seat, which was a nice flat, obviously nice and flat. And I then, did the sky. The paper was kind of bent underneath the seat and was flapping about a bit in the wind, but I put some rocks under there so it wouldn't flap too much, and then simply did the sky bending over it. So I just have to do it as best I can with the situation I've got, and sometimes with a big sky like the huge painting of the Grand Canyon, the 8-foot painting of the Grand Canyon here, that I did 23 days on site doing that one. And with that one, I remember it was something like day 11 when I finally got a sky. And the sky I got was absolute perfection, because there was a huge storm coming in from one side, and there was some blue sky here, and there was some rain clouds, and there was some water streaming down on one side, and there was and then there were shadows from it over here, and it was just glorious, exactly what I wanted. Up until that point, it had been nothing but blue. I had the sky I needed. It was 8 feet long. I did it. The next day, the sky had gone, and it was blue again the rest of the 23 days. And I think, the right things do happen. They just do. I don't know why or how, but they just do.
Well, and also you're making it happen for you by spending your time in the field. So part of it is lucky.
Yeah.
But also you talked about the power of will and being out there to be again and again and again. And if you show up for nature, nature will show up for you.
That's a very good point.
But you have to show up for nature.
Yeah.
And
excellent.
That leads me to my final question about showing up for nature. As this guest observed, you have established and forged a deep relationship with people and with the natural world. Mm-hmm. I was wondering how you, bringing those two thoughts together, your thoughts on conservation, preservation, and stewardship of natural places and things, and how, and the role that has in your thinking and your mission.
Okay, well, a very profound role, I'd say. First of all, in my personal practice, of course, that that leave no trace is absolutely gospel as far as I'm concerned. I was painting a place called Wistman's Wood, which is a very, very precious little piece of ancient woodland on Dartmoor, which is in Devon. And when I'd finished, I was sitting there for about four or 5 days doing this painting, and when I'd finished, I actually stood the grass back up again because it was such an untouched place, and I don't always do that, I must admit, but if I take rocks out to tie my drawing board to, I put them back where I found them, or try to. Not always easy. And so leave no trace is obviously a personal credo which I will never alter. And the people who are with me obviously agree that that's the way to go. So in my personal way of working, I try to respect nature as much as I possibly can. But I also have always in my talks talked about how the environment is being rent asunder really by our way of life, and many of the places I've worked in were pristine when I worked there, but they have been destroyed even in the last few years. I did a journey down the Platano River in Honduras, a 14-day journey through absolutely primary rainforest. You could see it hadn't been hunted for hundreds of years because the iguanas were this sort of size. And in a rainforest that's been hunted, the iguanas are about this size. So we did that. And now I understand that this entire forest has been taken over by the drug cartels. You can't go in there without the army, and they've taken most of the big trees out. And so these things are happening daily. They're not just happening, in 100 years, although a lot will happen in 100 years, I'm sure. Coral reefs where I've worked in the Maldives, one year I painted them. I got these lovely paintings of underwater. 2 years later I went back and they had been calcified. They were all bleached. The coral were all bleached. The fish were all gone. 2 years. And so the older I get, the more passionate I am about saying it like it is. These places are being destroyed, and I do what I can to help by raising money, by producing prints and that kind of thing, and all the profits from my prints go to conservation organizations or to help in disasters like the earthquake in Nepal, for example. I was due to go to Nepal a week after the earthquake, but I couldn't go, of course. And so I spent the time making a print, which, and in my village we had a big, I gave a lecture and everybody came, and we had an auction, we had all sorts of things. And we raised about £14,000 in about a week to send out to Nepal. I've got a school named after me in the rainforest in Honduras because I raised the money after Hurricane Mitch to re-roof that village, which a friend of mine was working with. And then they had some money left over, and they said they would like to build themselves a school. So I raised some more money, and they built themselves a school out of mud block. And I paid for the cement to render it afterwards, and the tin roof and the bits and pieces they needed. And I had the great honor of them naming the school after me, which one of the greatest honors of my life. And so I do try to get involved where I go and work, and try and do what I can. And I often raise money for, organizations which are working in these places. I've often thought that I ought to be more direct. I ought to become a tree hugger, and I'd go and chain myself to a tree to protect it from being cut down. But then I thought, no, much tempting though that is to make a demonstration like that, and I admire people who do it enormously, tempting as it is, my time is actually better spent doing what I do best and using the money to help, to the causes which are mitigating the destruction that's going on around us.
I just wanted to say that, Tony, you inspire me as an artist, as a conservationist, as a human being living their life, as you said, in relationship with others, in relationship with the world. You are a role model to all of us about how we can stand on this planet together. And thank you so much for what you do.
Well, thank you.